see all the time. So I just want to talk a little bit about LGBT communities in historical context. I put up some book covers, including that by Esther Rothblum, who's here, books that talk about how LGBT communities formed or what the background was, and kind of at the macro level, what people have written about is that in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was this move from more agricultural societies to more urban societies. So people had more choices. They could choose not to marry, which was hard to do in an agricultural society where their own offspring, et cetera, would help on the farm. They had more anonymity. They could meet other people like them. There was more of a sense of personal identity as opposed to their family name or kinship ties and so on. And so this was happening also for women. Women typically lived with their parents if they weren't married, and so it was hard for women to be lesbians in the sense that it was hard to bring their friends into the home, but if they met their friends in public, that was also difficult for women to do. They might be harassed by men. It wasn't really the norm to have unmarried women in groups, socializing and so on. And also people have written about World War II as a time when a lot of people moved away from rural areas, were put into gender-segregated places, women in the military, men in the military. In the case of women, were dressing in non-traditional ways and taking on non-traditional occupations, and they were moved away from their hometown, often overseas, for example. And then at the end of the war, for people who were overseas, they were brought back to the big port cities where those became big urban LGBT centers like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, New York, etc. And for many people, LGBT or heterosexual, it was often the first time they even heard about the word homosexual or heard about words like that and what that could mean. And people have also written about early centers like Harlem or Greenwich Village, Fire Island, among others. A recent book, I don't know if any of you have read this book by Martin Meeker called Contacts Desired, Gay and Lesbian Communications and Community, 1940s to 1970s. What he's focusing on here is how people found each other before there was an intranet, and in fact, when it was still illegal until 1957 to send homosexual materials through the mail. So how would you meet other people? And one of the quotes he has here is, seeking and pursuing meant that individuals may have visited doctors, read psychology journals, or browsed the shelves at the local library in order to learn more about their sexual desires. They may have picked up a newspaper or walked the streets looking for something or someone that was different, that was a little queer. They may have asked around and scoured catalogs for books and magazines published on the fringes of society and legality that promised stories about twilight men or odd girls. They may have moved to a city or a particular neighborhood that was rumored to harbor certain kinds of people, or they may have mimeographed their own circulars, written their own newsletters, or formed their own organizations, hoping that others would heed the call and join them. And the reason this book is called Contacts Desired is that Meeker focuses on the hobby directory, which was like a magazine you could get, where people would list their interests and hobbies. And they had the initial CD, and I've highlighted some of these in yellow, so you can see here CD, meaning that this person wanted contacts desired. And what I've tried to highlight here is this person said his hobbies were drama, ballet, physical culture, jewelry, and all things French. This person says he's single. This person says he's into physical culture. This person says he's looking for single members who are lonely. This guy is a florist. And this guy says his hobby is sunbathing. So, people kind of were able to say in code that they were gay in some way. So another thing about being homosexual or queer or LGBT in those days is somehow not only did you need to know what people looked like who were non-heterosexual, but they also had to be able to recognize that in you. So somehow you had to learn what to look like, what to wear, and so on. And so two mental health professionals, Lukes and Land, have said that some minority groups first become acculturated within their own cultural group and are then later socialized within the dominant culture. For example, when they first go to school or when they first start watching television. But members of sexual minority groups are first socialized by the dominant culture and later identify with a minority culture. And they have this quote, because sexual minorities are not easily identifiable to those in other cultures, they also are not easily identifiable to each other. And so I've put up some images of early, clothing to kind of give people the hint, often very gender non-normative clothing, so that there was kind of a look that started about what it meant to be non-heterosexual. So I want to talk about some of my siblings' research in terms of the implications it has for community. And even though I didn't look specifically at community in these studies, and even though there's a lot of other results that we looked at, I want to just show you some of the implications of specifically lesbians versus gay men versus bisexual women versus bisexual men versus people who are transgender. And this is based on 4 studies I did with a number of co-authors, my students and former students. One study compared sisters who were lesbian, bisexual, or heterosexual. Then we expanded that to brothers and sisters of LGBs. And then when Vermont was the first state to have civil unions, we compared couples who had civil unions with their heterosexual married siblings and partner. And also more recently, we looked at a sample of people who were transgender, either who identified as M to F, male to female, or F to M, female to male, or those who felt that neither category fit them very well. We call them genderqueer, which is a term that some people use for that kind of gender radical in-between category. So first I want to talk about lesbian communities, and I'm going to go through a number of different types of communities, but there are some commonalities across these groups. One of the commonalities is that many people who are LGBT talk about the fact that they are not so close to their families of origin. And so they often mention friends as their major sources of support, whereas heterosexuals often mention their families. And you see this in a number of different studies, that people who are LGBT talk about their families of friends, not so much their parents, their in-laws, their relatives, etc. Another commonalities among people who are LGBT is that actually LGBT communities are more demographically heterogeneous than our heterosexual communities. Many people who are heterosexual meet each other through high school, college, or the military, and those are very stratified by income, by educational level, by religion often, and of course also by income, by race and ethnicity. Whereas LGBTs meet in other kinds of places that are not so demographically stratified. We see our communities as racist and classist. I hear that a lot. But in fact, the recent studies about the year 2000 census, which included same-sex relationships, found that same-sex couples were more likely to be interracial by far than were census data of heterosexuals, for example. On the other hand, in the past, you might have had a rural town in Texas where anybody who wasn't a Republican got together. They were the radical group. A heterosexual woman was a librarian and a lesbian, and just anybody who sort of would meet each other. And they were quite demographically diverse. But what's happening now is you have a lot of specialty groups, as you can see from some of these images. So you can find people who are just like you in terms of interests. Gay men who adopted children from China, or lesbian rock climbers, any kind of specific community. And so I think actually you're getting to see less of this. You're getting to see more specialization, especially, of course, in urban areas. There's also very little research on LGBTs who are multicultural, and to what extent they feel included or marginalized, both by the LGBT and also the ethnic minority communities. And then another thing I think we really haven't looked at much, but it's a commonality across LGBT communities, is the role of ex-lovers. And I have some images here. Actually, in our civil union study, we found that both male and female same-sex couples were more likely to have friends who were ex-lovers than